everyone on our estate is really clued up in one way, shape or form. They know what's going on. They know the system doesn't work for them. It's divided across political lines. There's a lot of right-wing kind of thinking people on our estate. There's a lot of left-wing thinking people on our estate. There's a lot of conspiracy theorists on our estate. There's some people who don't care. People know. It's people's capacity when trying to maintain your just live from day to day that is the restriction. And that's what I said about time poverty earlier. It's a huge factor that's overlooked. There was a brilliant report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in 2007, which looked into the notion of time poverty and what it was and how it actually affects people. And they concluded that actually it was one of the biggest things that was holding us in this country back was the perfect storm of time poverty and financial poverty, that people do not have the time to elevate themselves out of financial poverty, therefore they're constantly stuck in both.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we get started, I just have a few short messages. First off, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe this podcast. It's the best way to help us grow and help me get on bigger and better guests. Also, don't forget you can pre-order my book, To the Moon, the GameStop Saga, right now by following the links in the description below. We've also got a few quick sponsors for the show today. With Christmas coming up, we all need some inspiration for presents. And it can be a really tough question, especially for the women in your lives. That's wives, girlfriends, mums, and sisters. Well, I might just have the answer for you. Unidragon wooden puzzles solve this problem. It might just be the coolest puzzle that you'll ever do. Unidragon puzzles are stunning pieces of artwork with vivid and vibrant colours. They do a range of wolves, tigers, and owls that look like cutouts from mosaics and stained glass windows, as well as traditional portraits of Chiang Mai, the Sagrada Familia, and the New York sunrise. These aren't just beautiful pieces of artwork in themselves. Each piece of the puzzle is shaped like a whole host of animals. That's butterflies, lizards, whales, and more. So you could theoretically have a lion's head made up of everything it would eat for breakfast. The best part is that listeners of Chatter will get a 10% discount by using the code CHATTER. That's CHATTER. There are different packs for children and adults, and each puzzle is packed with a premium wooden gift box. New puzzles are released every month, so keep an eye on the website for new designs coming out all the time. Get a fun puzzle, a colourful and unique piece of artwork, and a great present all in one. Go to unidragon.com or .eu or follow the link in the description below. And don't forget to use your discount code CHATTER for 10% off your puzzle. That's Unidragon. Puzzling artwork and a truly unique gift. Comedy is a really crucial art form, especially in a world where government power seems to be rapidly expanding. It's one of the most effective ways to speak truth to power. And to that end, today, I bring you the Behind the Bits podcast with Scott Curtis, a podcast about the tragedy and triumph of stand-up comedy. Every week, Scott has a new comedian on the show to talk about inspiration for their comedy, the struggles of the industry, and how they find themselves stumbling into the world of comedy. In one of my favourite recent episodes, Scott spoke to Liz Mail, a New Jerseyite who began comedy at 16. The show can swing between hilariously funny and incredibly poignant at times. She spoke about realising the problems you had as a child in retrospect, smoking weed as a waitress, mental health, breaking rules, and the wild rollercoaster of performing on stage. You'll get Behind the Bits wherever you find your podcast. Apple, Spotify, and more. That's Behind the Bits with Scott Curtis, the best podcast to get to know the people behind the jokes. Links for everything will be in the description below. So, check them out, and then please enjoy the podcast. Even things that should cause like major outrage, they just like, there's a few days and then...
Like, yeah, it's on to the next thing.
Like it never happened.
Yes, it's all very
like the policing bill.
No. Yeah.
The tyranny.
Quite.
Yeah, it's a bit frustrating. Mm-hmm. But what can you do? Anyway, let's do this.
Okay.
So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I'm here with Steve Topple, journalist and broadcaster. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
No problem.
I'm just going to give you a pre-warning now. I'm usually the interviewer, so you'll have to rein me in if I'm starting asking you questions, because I'm not usually the interviewee. so just keep me in check, Josh, please.
Oh, no problem, man. I mean, it's more of a conversation. People always want the exact questions in advance and stuff, but it's a back and forth. It's not about just me asking you something, because I don't know, I find that to be not as interesting to watch. The best interviews to watch are normally when there's a good rapport, at least.
Exactly, yeah. I completely agree.
So how did you start, should we start with the Canary? How did you end up working at the Canary?
Okay, so there is a bit more of a backstory to it than that. I started writing when I was on employment support allowance, claiming benefits. I couldn't afford to get to any protests. I was brought up in a very political household. My father, there's a bit of an interesting match made in kind of heaven. My father was an atheist communist and my mother was a Christian Green Party member. And so I grew up in a very, very kind of political household. Marx and Engels littered the bookshelves. My dad used to wave the Morning Star at me over breakfast every morning and scream at question time on a Thursday night, as we all do still if we watch it. So I grew up surrounded by politics but never really did anything with it. The sort of life situations and circumstances led to me claiming unemployed disability sick benefits, and politics kind of came back to me at that point. This was around late 2014. And I couldn't afford to get to protests. I was living in Suffolk at the time, and obviously most demos happened in London. So I thought, I'm going to start writing, because Twitter wasn't long enough. It was back in the golden age of Twitter when it was 140 characters.
We never thought we'd be nostalgic for that, right?
All those years ago. So I started writing, and I penned this piece about Ed Miliband's leadership of the Labour Party, actually, and the background to that and who he was working with on his economic policy. And I spoke to a journalist and anthropologist called Will Black, who's written a couple of books. And he looked over my article and said, oh, this is excellent, you should just publish it. And he gave me a few hints and tips, and I published it, and it kind of started from there. People asked me to go on television shows. I used to do PMQ's coverage for The Independent. And then in April 2016, the Canary came along. It was after the Panama Papers actually broke, because I did a lot of work on the Panama Papers, and I was on sort of Al Jazeera and Russia Today and other television programs. And obviously the Canary spotted this and said, look, we've just started. Would you like to come and write for us? So writing as a form of protest, because I had no other outlet, eventually then turned into a job, which I never planned to do. I'm not a journalist by trade. I didn't go to university. I haven't got a degree in anything. I just sort of wrote because I was angry and frustrated, and it was an outlet for me, and it's ended up being a career.
I am just going to shut this window.
You shut the window, won't?
They're going to be 100% definitely being loud while we're talking. Because there's no way, because I guess, of course, that's not there when I'm setting up. But once we start recording.
South London.
But I can just edit that all out and
make
it look like it never happened.
Of course.
So had you done any writing before you started? Was it something that you had considered, even as a career or a hobby before 2014, back in the golden age of Twitter?
No, never. I left school with, got my GCSEs, I got an A in English and A in English literature, so I wasn't bad at writing. I'd never considered it as a career option. My background was originally, I went to stage school, actually. I got a scholarship to a stage school post-16. I was a singer and dancer and actor. That kind of didn't work out for various reasons. I gave that up and ended up in hospitality and was in hotel management for quite a few years. So I suppose there's elements of when you're running a large hotel with sort of 150 staff and a budget of sort of 6-7 million quid a year, your written ability to deal with that kind of level of business has to be quite good anyway. So I suppose there was elements of that in it. Also, you have to be very analytical being a hotel manager, and being a journalist, you have to be very analytical. So I suppose there's crossover skills I learned, but no, not really. No, never ever considered it. It just kind of happened. I mean, I should have guessed, given the upbringing I had and given the amount of attention in my childhood that was given to politics that I may come back to at some point. But I think it's something that I expect a lot of people would say, that actually if you've been brought up in the political household, you sometimes rebel against it, maybe. I mean, my father was a very prominent member of the Communist Party in the 50s and 60s, at the time when it was flourishing in this country against the backdrop of the Cold War. And he had a son and a daughter by a previous marriage. They've kind of gone the other way. My half-brother, who I don't communicate with, is I can only describe him as a fascist. He's a Golden Dawn supporter in Greece.
Right.
My sister is a UKIP supporter, very anti-Brexit. And this is from an extremely left-wing background. So they kind of went the other way. I kind of ignored politics, I suppose, in the way of rebelling against it. But I think when you have the background I have, you can only ignore it for so long. Eventually it catches up with you. And it kind of caught up with me. So here we are. The Canary was a brilliant opportunity. It branched me out into other areas, obviously doing broadcast work, which I've done a lot of. I've gone to music journalism because music was what I actually trained to do originally, so that's kind of interesting. Yeah, I've never really analysed myself properly. I suppose, things I used to do as a child and was influenced with and involved in as a child have come back round, actually, because I now do music journalism and broadcasting and interviewing artists and so on and so forth. So, it's funny turn of events.
Yeah, it's funny how that happens. Like, you can get the things that you maybe didn't consider to be like that important in your childhood, like suddenly your love of it like comes back around, which is really interesting. I mean, I'd never thought I'd be end up as a journalist when I was in school. Like, I studied law.
Okay. I was going to ask you what you did because you went to university in Belfast, didn't you?
Yeah. So I never thought I'd end up here, but I mean, here we are.
And what led you to this point?
I wanted to be a journalist when I finished uni because I basically saw the law students that I was going to be following into like law firms, and they looked dead behind the eyes. Like there was nothing there. It was like, and I was like, I don't like this enough to like kill myself over it, or just like, turn into like a soulless drone. Yeah. So then I went to Canada and I worked for a magazine there as the editor, somehow straight out. And then just went from there. And then I started the podcast after I heard, I watched an episode of Joe Rogan with Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein, and like the conversation was just fantastic. It was like 3 hours, and I was like, man, I want to make a platform where I can sit in on fantastic people talking about things. So it was like purely selfish. But so then, the Canary, right? So when did you you started working for them in 2000?
Yeah, it's April 2016. I mean, the Canary is quite
so right before Brexit then.
Yeah. The Canary launched in October 2015. It was our story is fairly well known. It started off with a conversation between who is now our ex-editor at large, Kerry Ann Mendoza, who's left due to personal reasons. But it started off with a conversation between her and some other people about how broken the media was in the UK, how messed up the corporate media was, and how captured by vested interests, and what they were going to do about this from a left-wing perspective. So they had £500 between them, which was all the spare money they had, and they thought, well, let's just try this and see if it works. So the Canary launched in October 2015. £500 was all they had in the bank, and we were talking about this in the meeting the other day. They were earning like 14 pence a month or something ridiculous for the first few months. They had to be able to commit to work for free, essentially, to begin with. By the time I joined in April 2016, it was a fully fledged outlet, which was
really blew up quickly.
Yeah, it was quite. It came out of nowhere. I mean, it wasn't a deliberate decision to launch it. Interestingly, at the same time as Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, it was just things sort of merged and events happened that led to that point. But it's undeniable that a lot of the Canary's original success came from the Jeremy Corbyn movement, because obviously the outlet was a supporter of him in principle. It just blew up from nowhere, really. I mean, a lot of our success came from oddly mistakes we made in the first place. We've always been quite open about that. There were certain things we did wrong.
Like what?
So one of the biggest moments for me, which really sort of propelled the Canary into not only the psyche of the corporate media, but also the political psyche, was a story I did in 2016 about how a PR firm was involved with the coup that was happening against Corbyn at the time. There was this PR firm which was run by loads of old Labour people who were previously like advisors to Blair and who were on the centre-right of the Labour Party. And I did this sort of investigative piece which was researching this PR firm and their involvements with the Labour Party and who was linked to who and so on and so forth, and concluded that this PR firm was in some way, shape or form assisting the campaign against Corbyn by seeding stories to the media and so on and so forth, what PR firms do. Looking back on reflection now, I didn't construct the article in the best I would have liked to. It's kind of started with the punchline, if you like, whereas I should have built it up and structured it better. You live and learn. I wasn't a trade journalist. I knew there was a story in it. But the article was mentioned on Mar by Len McCluskey. He brought up this issue and said in the Canary, Steve Topple has reported blah, 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 blah. And obviously, as soon as that was mentioned, the meltdown occurred in the corporate media. Who's this Canary? Who's this Steve Topple? And that's kind of then drew attention to us, and it continued from there. The 2017 election was a turning point. We had, I think it was 8 million readers in the run-up to the general election. That's nearly a fifth of the voting population read something by the Canary in the run-up to the 2017 general election. We moved into the top 250 most viewed websites in the UK. We were being read more than the Times, more than New Statesman, more than Economist, more than The Spectator, more than Daily Star. It was quite kind of mad. My partner Nicola always tells the story of during that election where I'd gone to bed, and about half an hour after going to bed I was still asleep, and I sat up bolt upright and started thinking I was typing on my laptop. It was just story after story. It was just constant. I was literally typing in my sleep. It's true story. And it was just it was bizarre being at the centre of all that, but also the attention that was put upon us as well. There was constant stories in the media about where has this Canary come from? What, disrupting this, doing that, supporting Corbyn, blah, blah, blah.
Something.
It was peculiar. But it was a moment in time, much like what I know we're going to talk about later, the GameStop situation. It was a moment in time where forces converged to put us in this situation. And obviously the outcome of the 2017 election wasn't what was desired, but from our point of view, it cemented us, and it also cemented independent media more broadly as a force now within the overall media scene in the UK, and that's never really waned. Our business model has changed due to factors out of our control. A lot of our traffic used to be generated through Facebook. Obviously, their algorithm changes, which they admitted later on expressly targeted left-wing news outlets. That meant we had to change what we did and how we operated. A lot of our revenue was driven originally by Google advertising. Again, that's dropped off. So we've had to shift, as a lot of media outlets have done, to more of a subscription model, but our principles are still the same, and the way we operate is still the same. The way we organise ourselves is slightly different now, but yeah, it was. I hate kind of X Factor journey roller coaster kind of analogies, but it's been a very strange experience, to say the least, working for the Canary, but a very, very valuable one. We were present at a moment in history, so.
That's a really good way of putting that. Actually, you were present at a moment in history. I mean, I guess that just happens every day now, doesn't it? Like, well, it's not a new. It's not like it might have said it was a more novel back then. Now I'm a little bit like, oh,
exactly. We were talking about this off air, weren't we? About how you just kind of roll from one historical moment to the next, as such. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, but yeah. What a time to be alive! Like,
yeah.
Well, I mean, I'd rather this than it be boring. Do you know what I mean? A little bit of me is like, part of me is like, oh my God, like why can't it all just be like very simple and easy? And like why do we have to be living through like such like consequential times? But then part of me is just like, come on, like let's go for it.
This is the thing, exactly. No, I interviewed Ken Loach a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking on a similar issue, and from a perspective of it, obviously from his perspective, left wing, but it can be from any political wing, left wing or right wing. Over the years, sort of politics has been defined by struggle in one way, shape or form, and it's been defined by the constant fight and constantly having to battle, whether you're on the left or the right. There's still a fight between warring factions in politics, and that is what's defined how politics is approached over the years. And of course, there's always 2017 was a historical moment. Boris Johnson being elected, there's historical moments all the time now. It is the nature of the constant fight. What's changed, and what Ken Loach was saying, which is quite right, is the issue has become more pressing because of climate change and the climate emergency.
Do you see that as the biggest thing we have to deal with? Like, is that to you is that like priority, like numero uno? Like, no. Is that the top? Like, what is the biggest issue for you, do you think, like that we probably have to deal with at the minute?
Okay, so
go for it, man.
That's all right. Yeah. I've never touched on it. I don't write about climate change. It's not something I really write on. I wrote a lot about fracking several years ago. Climate change isn't something I've really touched on. I personally believe that while it's the biggest issue we face as a planet and as a ecosystem and as a species, those with the power will deal with it either way. You see greenwashing all the time. It's happening as we speak. The climate movement and the green movement has been essentially co-opted. And I think that it will be dealt with by hook or by crook. They're already talking about sort of weather adaptation. They used to be the thing, conspiracy theories, manipulating the weather. Now they're openly talking about it. UN said in 2017, 2018.
Sulfur in the atmosphere.
Yeah, we'll have to manipulate the weather. The corporate monoliths will do something about it and stop and avert a catastrophe. I do believe they will. How it will pan out for maybe the global south is another matter entirely. How it will pan out for Africa is another matter entirely, but something will be done about it. And my concern is that the movement is being co-opted. So no, I don't think it will be dealt with. It's a very big issue. The biggest issue we face, in my opinion, is the species level way, and we can get onto this later actually, the species level way we structure ourselves.
In what sense?
In the sense of how can I put this without sounding completely off the wall?
Oh no, don't worry, man.
We've always structured ourselves. I personally think we have a massive problem with hierarchy and how we have evolved as a species and how we structure ourselves as a species. I was reading up on you and I was reading up about To the Moon and what you'd written about this project. Doing the book on GameStop. And I was quite interested by some of the things you were saying there about sort of corruption and power and what have you. And we both seem to like Naomi Klein. We both talk about Naomi Klein a lot. We have this issue that we've always structured ourselves where there are a few people in charge and everyone else is below. You can trace it back 10,000 years to the earliest civilizations. That's how we've always done things. It's almost like the symptoms changed, whether it be what is now corporatism, capitalism, feudalism, whatever form of society you want to put on it. The symptoms are always different, but the illness is the same, that we allow ourselves to leave a few people in charge while the rest of us have to do what we're told, effectively. And I don't mean that in an anarchist kind of way. I mean, we've never moved past mammal state almost, considering we think we're the most intelligent species in the known universe. We haven't evolved as much as we think we have, and we still live in this kind of how other mammals live, in terms of there's always a leader, always someone in charge, and the rest of us do what we're told. And when you factor in human predispositions like greed and desire and human and basic emotions, never ends well.
No.
And it never has ended well. There's not been one point through history where having power so concentrated has worked out well. Otherwise we wouldn't be here.
That's a good way of putting it, actually. I guess, yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
And so for me,
a way that many people, I think, could agree. Like, you don't have to be left wing to agree with
it's not about politics. It's bigger than politics. It's about fundamentally, it's about how we operate as a species. I mean, I suppose the comparison I'd make is that given we behave and have put ourselves across this planet almost like insects do in terms of the way we have infested this planet, because we've reached every four corners of this planet. We're everywhere. You could say insects. Some people may consider us a virus. The way
I don't like looking at it like that.
I think it's too harsh.
What do you do to a virus? Like, you eradicate it.
Exactly.
I don't like that kind of.
I think that's too harsh. I think maybe insect is a better analogy. The way there are so many of us and so spread out, and also our population concentrations have become so dense. We live on top of each other, and yet we don't organise ourselves in the way insects would do, where they all have a common purpose, all have a common goal, although there is always one queen in charge. The majority of them are all working towards the same thing. We're still in that state of, we look to leaders, we look to be led, which ultimately, when combined with our most basic emotions as sentient creatures, leads to our downfall. It's what's led us to this point across at least 10,000 years of history, has led us to where we're at now, where the climate's screwed, we're facing a catastrophe, and ultimately it's of our own making. Not necessarily all our own making in terms of that. I like the fact and figure that across the past sort of 30-odd years, 75% of greenhouse gas emissions have come from 100 corporations. It's this whole notion of we've all got to do our bit is nonsense. We haven't got to do our bit. It's a small group of people have caused this. We've allowed them to do it, so we have to bear some responsibility for that.
There's definitely a sense in that. I was listening to a great conversation with on Lex Fridman's podcast yesterday, actually, where he'd asked about, like, if a society is going down a direction that you believe to be wrong, or it's in a situation that you believe to be wrong, that how much responsibility or action do you think that one individual should take? And the guy, I cannot remember his name, he's a Harvard philosophy professor, and he fucked me off unbelievably because he kept saying Sartre about Jean-Paul Sartre.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and he kept saying Sartre, and I was just like, you're a philosophy professor. You should know how to pronounce the fucking name. And
alarm bells immediately.
Yeah, I know. But, well, I mean, it was brilliant. It was a really fantastic conversation. It was just that thing, the first 30 minutes when they were discussing it, I had to try so hard not to switch it off, because I was like, I'm really enjoying this. But every now and again, he would say, like, Sartre, and I'd be like, man, just, like, say it right.
And you managed to maintain your concentration, though?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thankfully. But he was basically saying that like, we all participate in society. We should take some level of responsibility. Like, what that is difficult to say. But, like, what would you say is your thought on or your sense of, like, what do we do? Like, what's the remedy in your mind to the concentration of power?
It's a very difficult question, and it's become more difficult. Just to backtrack slightly. I don't, in my head and the way I think, I don't view things in terms of sort of recent history. I do like to try and broaden out thinking across sort of thousands and thousands of years. I don't know what the solution is. Me and my partner Nicola constantly have this debate, because she says, she won't mind me saying this, I'm sure. She says, all you do is moan and don't come with solutions, which is fine. I understand that. I'm really not sure, because the problem is there is an imbalance between our technological progression, in my opinion, between what, as a species, we are able to harness, and what we know and what we understand about the universe and the way we interact with it, and how we have developed in terms of both technology and our intellectual understanding. But again, that is concentrated in the hands of very few people. For the rest of us, I think, are regressing. As a species, we are regressing in terms of the fact that since the end of the Second World War, particularly, which I know, again, I've read sort of you speak about that as well, since the end of the Second World War, but specifically as you pinpoint since 1980, really, there's been a seismic shift in the way we live and the way we exist almost. And while as a species as a whole, we seem to be progressing, I think as individuals we've regressed, and it's an almost intentional regression that's been pushed upon us in terms of that. On its most basic level, we have 24-hour news now and social media. Our brains are on information overload. We are not designed. technology and our brain capacity have not kept pace with each other. I don't personally think. That's not saying we're stupid. That's saying that we are on information overload. We've got 24/7 news on us all the time. Social media has become the biggest distraction there is to free and deep thought in some respects. And everything's done online, shopping's done online. Naomi Klein again, and Johann Hari actually wrote about it quite well, in terms of that the sense of community that we used to have has been completely lost or bastardized in some respects. We are all becoming more and more consumed by the system, whatever you want to call that, capitalist, corporatist, neoliberalism, whatever. We're becoming more and more consumed by the system. Our time is less. We're all victims of time poverty. Some of us are victims of time poverty and financial poverty, which is a perfect storm. We are thinking less as a whole and doing more, but what we're doing isn't actually of benefit to anyone. And it's this disparity between our overall advances as a collective, but then our individual regression, which I do think is happening, which has created this perfect storm of, well, what is the way out of this situation? I'd love to be a glass half full kind of person, but unfortunately I'm not. I'm somewhat half empty. And I think, have we gone too far? Is the rot too deep? That to actually change things, it would take something so seismic that the population as a whole would not be able to cope with that change. That actually we would just collapse, because we are so used to now, firstly, going back to my point about hierarchy, we're so used to having people lead us and people in charge. And as we were talking about off air, that almost the majority of the population, we were talking about the fact that Laura Kuenssberg and Lewis Goodall from the BBC were karaokeing and partying at the Tory party after conference and just doesn't seem ashamed about the fact. And we were saying off air that most people would be like, whatever. And this is not people's fault. I'd like to make it very clear. I'm not being patronising and I'm not dismissing people's intelligence. There's a vast difference between intelligence and intellect, in my opinion. Boris Johnson's an intellectual. He's thick as pig shit. But he is. Yeah. He had an Eastern education, so he knows a lot of things. Doesn't make him intelligent. That's not to say that it's because people aren't intelligent. People's lives are so consumed by living and having to survive now, and being keeping up with social media, doing your online shopping, going out to work to earn enough money, going to your second job to earn enough money to be able to buy a few nice things. Where's the next holiday coming from? What's happening with this? What's happening with that? I need to buy this. I need to... Our lives are overwhelmed now completely, and that leaves no room for people to be able to actually step back and critically think. And this is how the system and its proponents get away with what they do. We are overwhelmed as a species. Our brains are constantly overwhelmed. And that is only becoming worse. That ain't going to improve. Therefore, by default, I cannot see the collective action that's needed to be able to change things from the bottom up. Change will only continue to come from the top, from the people who do have the time to go, right, well, we need to do this and change this. And you see it all the time. You see it especially on the left. It seems to be... In politics, people think it's the preserve of the right, that somehow there's rich people sort of pulling the strings and they're in charge and blah, blah. It's the same on the left. It's the same whether you were at the Labour Party conference under Keir Starmer, or, to be brutally honest, and this will put the cat amongst the pigeons with a lot of people, whether you were at the counter festival, The World Transformed, which was a counter festival in Brighton, which was kind of the Corbyn left organising and getting together. They've been doing it a few years. It's still people in positions of privilege deciding what is good for the rest of us. I can afford to go to the World Transformed, and I'm a journalist. So therefore, the scenarios and the problems are still the same, and I cannot see how we can get out of that. I cannot see. I think we're too far gone. I think we're going to have to tolerate trotting along, and as, again, Ken Loach summed up to me a couple of weeks ago, taking these bits of progress where we can grab them and making the best of a bad situation. Because to truly change as a species, we all have to be on board with that change. Otherwise, it won't work. You can't have... And it was the problem with the Corbyn movement. There was a lot of talk about... And please interrupt me if I'm going on, by the way, because I will just go on. It was one of the issues with the Corbyn movement. There was a lot of chat at the time about, oh my goodness, Corbyn's going to bring in socialism. Blah, blah. That was the main stick that was used to beat him with by the corporate press and the right of the political spectrum. How he's going to enact socialism and it's going to be a disaster for this country was the negative. The positive was, oh, finally, we've got a socialist leader of the Labour Party who was going to enact progressive egalitarian policies, etc., etc. Both of those statements were false.
Okay, why was the latter false?
Corbyn was a democratic socialist. He wasn't a socialist. No socialist would have fostered the plan which him and John McDonnell did to enact your policies. You'd issue 500 billion worth of gilts to the stock markets. How's that socialist? Okay. Borrow from the stock markets to put in socialist policies. Firstly, that was a big gamble that the stock markets would even accept the gilts in the first place. For what?
You're talking about their plan to use quantitative easing to get
effectively,
to fund a lot of projects. Okay.
Effectively. I personally didn't, even if they got elected, it would be highly unlikely that would happen. But secondly, there's nothing socialist about investing in the system, which is as again, we will discuss later on, which is the rot around us. So, no, he wasn't socialist. He was progressive and a progressive democratic socialist, but he was more along the sort of Nordic model of politics. And so for me, that would have been a change. And how long would it have been a change for anyway? Again, we're talking, everything's always spoken about in what seems like very grand ideas, very big ideas, very long-term ideas. This is our political system. Corbyn would have been in power for 2, maybe 3 governments before there was a switcheroo again, and we went back to a right-wing government. That's just how it works. Yeah. These things are in a constant state of flux.
I wouldn't even describe it as a right-wing government. I like the way I look at it is that it's an establishment government.
Yeah. I mean, that's another edition of this show in itself. The sort of lines of left and right. Yeah, okay, establishment, corporatist government, I suppose is one way to put it. But so to sum up, I think we're too far gone. I cannot see that we can fundamentally change as a species. I think we can continue to tinker around the edges as we are doing and trying our best to improve things. But again, it's like... Again, I keep referring back to this, but it's still fresh in my mind. Ken Loach said to me, we fought for the 8-hour day. Where the hell's that now?
Yeah. Comedy is a really crucial art form, especially in a world where government power seems to be rapidly expanding. It's one of the most effective ways to speak truth to power. And to that end, today I bring you the Behind the Bits podcast with Scott Curtis, a podcast about the tragedy and triumph of stand-up comedy. Every week, Scott has a new comedian on the show to talk about inspiration for their comedy, the struggles of the industry, and how they find themselves stumbling into the world of comedy. In one of my favourite recent episodes, Scott spoke to Liz Mail, a New Jerseyite who began comedy at 16. The show can swing between hilariously funny and incredibly poignant at times. She spoke about realising the problems you had as a child in retrospect, smoking weed as a waitress, mental health, breaking rules, and the wild rollercoaster of performing on stage. You'll get Behind the Bits wherever you find your podcast. Apple, Spotify, and more. That's Behind the Bits with Scott Curtis, the best podcast to get to know the people behind the jokes.
Yeah. Where's that gone? We fought for the minimum wage. Where's that if you're not guaranteed any hours in the gig economy? Where have we fought for all these things. They came in for a bit and they lost again. And this rolling stone just keeps on rolling. And it's how large we allow it to get and how much control we have over its forward momentum. Ultimately, is the question, not whether we can really, really change. Because I don't think we can. Sorry, it's very defeatist. But
there was a lot there. You said a lot of things I want to address. I don't know where to start. So I want to come back to this idea of regression because I think that's a really cool thing to discuss. But what you're suggesting essentially is that like we're in need of a revolution of some form, but that you don't think we're capable, perhaps, or even if we did do it, that most of us aren't. We're too soft and we couldn't survive like what that would do, because I see a lot of people advocating for like the revolution to come. And most of the time I'm like, look, people, you have no idea what that's going to be like. Because what happens when everything breaks down is this, like, there's chaos, there's death, there's violence, there's there's war. Like, when you talk about, like, tearing down the system, you have to know that madness is going to come next. It's like when you tear down the order of things, like, the chaos is there. Like, and that's what you then have to, like, start again from scratch. Yeah. And that leads to a lot of death, a lot of poverty, a lot of just unfortunate things. So it's interesting to say that you think we couldn't handle it, because I think you're probably right. But do you think, so you say you think we're too far gone. Like, is there hope? Like, do you think that there's, you not think there's, like, ways we can figure out how to improve things? Because, like, to me, we are on, like, a long arc of history of everything getting constantly better, right? What we're on is we're just in a constant fight for making things a little bit better. Yep. And when we forget that, and, like, when Francis Fukuyama said, "Oh, end of history," it's like, it's almost like a resignation. It's like, well, this is as good as it's going to get. And then we start to, like, lose that sense that we fought for things, and we have to continue to fight to make the system better as such. And do you think there's a chance that we can, I don't know, arrange ourselves in a way that allows us to, like, sit down and be like, right, okay, guys, we've got some good stuff here. We've got rid of loads of poverty. We've got, we've eliminated a lot of violence. Like, where we've got to from 2,000 years ago is pretty good. But, like, we can do things better. We've allowed things to degrade. We've allowed, like, the system and a lot of our institutions to become corrupted and rotten and just sort of completely no longer fulfilling the function that they were created to do, essentially, or at least in principle. Yes. Yep. I have this weird hope that we can do, like, what would be the equivalent of, like, a constitutional convention. I call it the Big Review of Britain. Okay. And I still hope that we could sit enough smart, passionate people down from all corners of society and be like, right, okay, guys, let's do it. Because there are examples in history where people have organized themselves like that. They haven't always gone well, but sometimes they've done some good stuff. Like for example, post-apartheid South Africa is not a fantastic example, but, like, there's a good example.
In 1930s Spain, in Catalonia, anarcho-communists took over a region effectively, and it was working really well until the British and the Spanish fascists got involved and booted them out because it was working too well. So there are, you're correct, there are small pockets throughout history of where things like this have happened.
So, like, do you think that we're capable of that? Like, is that something we can get to?
My head tells me no. My heart tells me I'd like to think so. There was a very interesting project that Naomi Klein was involved in a few years ago. They had
the sort of thing I mean.
Yeah. Okay. So you know what I'm going to say. If you don't know at home, basically Naomi Klein and a load of the sort of more progressive thinkers of the world locked themselves in a room for about 3 days or something to try and thrash out exactly what to do about the mess we're in. And the basic principle that came out was one that I do agree with. If we are going to change it, it's the only way it's probably going to happen, is that you start with communities. You start back, take it right back to basics, ignore the macro issues, both economically and socially, and take it back to basics and start with change within small communities around the globe. And then it's almost like a principle of sort of how Marx outlined socialism was sort of a stepping stone to communism almost, that you plant a seed and it kind of spreads. I thought there was some merit in that because you have to. It's not the problem is we're not lacking capacity as humans. That's not what I think. I think we are more than capable of changing collectively. I think the problem is the system won't let us, and therefore by default, everyone is so caught up in the system that it's impossible to almost break the shackles of it. To break the shackles of it, you have to just stop and say no to everything. Literally everything. has to be said no to. Like, for example, on the most basic level today, I would have walked here because I would have refused to get an Uber. I'm not going to go back home and grab something for dinner from Tesco's because they're a multi-million-pound company who cooks their books year in, year out. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It infests. Everything is infected by the system in our lives now. And I think we have the capacity, and I think that if it was going to happen, putting my optimistic head on, it would have to start in small communities. We have to change the way we operate and look to rebuilding from the bottom up and starting any kind of movement on a community level, because we do have the capacity to understand. And most people do understand, and this is the thing. This is the frustration, I suppose. Most people know everything's fucked. People aren't stupid. They do.
Yeah.
No, you speak to it. So me and my girlfriend come from one of the poorest council estates in England. For people who don't necessarily know what this means, the country is divided into lower super output areas. These are little pockets of populations broken down by postcode where the government studies you on a population of about 1,000 to 1,500 people, and they collect data on that level. Most people don't know about it, but it is done. And so we're divided up into these little lower super output areas, which collects all sorts of information on us, and it works out how rich or poor we are, basically. There's 32,000 of these. Our estate is like in the top 4% for pensioner poverty, top 5% for child poverty, and top 10% for overall poverty out of 32,000 areas. Really, really poor. Everyone on our estate is really clued up in one way, shape or form. They know what's going on. They know the system doesn't work for them. It's divided across political lines. There's a lot of right-wing kind of thinking people on our estate. There's a lot of left-wing thinking people on our estate. There's a lot of conspiracy theorists on our estate. There's some people who don't care. People know. It's people's capacity when trying to maintain your just live from day to day that is the restriction. And that's what I said about time poverty earlier. It's a huge factor that's overlooked. There was a brilliant report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in 2007, which looked into the notion of time poverty and what it was and how it actually affects people. And they concluded that actually it was one of the biggest things that was holding us in this country back was the perfect storm of time poverty and financial poverty, that people do not have the time to elevate themselves out of financial poverty, therefore they're constantly stuck in both. This work was never expanded on.
It's like just you're running around.
It's just a constant cycle. These ideas were never expanded upon. You don't have time poverty studied anymore, and I think there's a trick being missed there. The point being that it's not that people don't have the thought and don't understand how bad things are. You get so consumed by just living that any chance to even consider how you would like it changed, let alone doing something to change it, goes out the window because you cannot survive. And it's reflected in the most basic things like voter turnout. There was this whole big hoo-ha about how Corbyn mobilised the working classes. I find working class term irrelevant these days, by the way. Class structure is not what it used to be. Socioeconomic status or social grade is a far better measure of that. There's big hoo-ha about the working classes mobilised and voted for Corbyn. No, they fucking didn't. If you look at the electoral data, the turnout of what are known as social grades D and E, which is people in manual, low-skilled jobs or who rely on social security, turnout hit its lowest in 2019 ever. 53% of DE social grade people voted. That was it.
Whoa.
47% didn't vote. That's over 6 million people, the poorest people, by the way, in the country, who did not vote.
Why do you think that is?
Because they see things don't change for them. They see that and it's decreased over time.
It's just apathy?
No, I don't know. It's not apathy in terms of people aren't politically engaged. They are politically engaged. They see it for what it is.
But I just mean like apathy towards whether it's like who they're going to vote for in terms of like, oh, well, they're all the same, like that kind of apathy.
Yes, okay, yeah. In those terms, yeah. It's the fact that whoever you tick the box for, it doesn't make a blind bit of difference to my circumstance. It will not take away the fact that I am tied to the DWP constantly for money. It will not take away the fact that healthcare in this country is atrocious. It will not take away the fact that I have to work God all hours to be able to put a meagre amount of food on the table. It will not change the X, Y, and Z state of my social housing, whatever. So apathy on those terms, yes. No change is sin. It's why Brexit was such a turnout, because there was a glimmer of something different for a period of time. Whether or not Brexit was right or wrong really doesn't matter. That's why the turnout was so high, because it was something different. It was an opportunity for people to actually say something and cast a vote, and it might change something. General elections don't do that. And moreover, when you drill deeper into the data, the turn away of the poorest people from the Labour Party has been happening since 2005. You started off with C2s.
Why do you think 2005 was the turning point where people got turned off?
I don't know. That's quite interesting. I'm not sure. Okay. Was it the Iraq War? Because
that's why it doesn't feel like the sort of thing that would lead to it. Maybe it was. Maybe that's like the issue that's. Because if you're talking about, would you say CD grade or C2, was it?
C2, so you've got C1 is kind of upper working class almost, if you like. C2 is skilled supervisory roles, but manual, if you like.
Okay, so we're not talking about like the exodus or like the middle class then?
No. C2 is upper working class. They started turning away in 2005. That continued in 2010. In 2015, it continued again. Meanwhile, DEs, which are the poorest people, the turn away started in 2010. In 2015, it completely evaporated from both Labour and the Tories, as we know, because the vote went to UKIP. In the 2017 election, where UKIP basically didn't stand,
was it the Brexit Party at that point?
No, it was still UKIP, but it's just Brexit was done, and Brexit Party was 2019. In 2017, DEs, the poorest people, swung back to Labour and Tories. But if you look at the swing back to the Tories was 12%. Labour only picked up, I think it was 7% of those voters. So already, and this was Corbyn's golden year, 2017, where he trounced them. He didn't, in terms of the working class.
1 point away or whatever.
Yeah. But more of the poorest people voted Tory in that election from previously voting UKIP. Corbyn still got more votes in the DEs, but the swing was to the Tories. And then in 2019, it was game over, and more of the DEs voted Tory than they did Labour. But the biggest party was the didn't come out and vote party. And as I say, it was 47% of DEs did not vote in 2019, which is around 6 million people.
That's a people, man.
And this is the point. But this is, and this has been a bit of a long-ass way to come back to the point I was trying to make. But the point is, it's not that we don't have the capacity for change. Our lives are just such that we're too caught up in day-to-day drama and having to survive under the system that we don't have the capacity to be able to do anything about it and live at the same time. Our political institutions are broken. Corporations dominate every aspect of our lives, and this pincer movement of a defunct, broken democratic system coupled with an all-powerful corporatist system has ensnared most of us now, and it's almost impossible to get out of that. It's like a shark caught in the net.
Yeah, I mean I like to try and stay as positive as possible.
I can't dress it up.
No,
it's something it's not.
It's an accurate summation of where we're at. I mean, I guess I guess the thing that I find is that you see, I think you're right about the time poverty. That's it. Because we can say that people maybe had less time if you go back to like industrial revolution times, like people were working 14, 15, 16-hour days, 7 days a week. So I think that the time poverty is not the sole cause of this. I think what it is, and again, you've identified, was the social media, phone technology, like information overload aspect of things is what has just, I don't know, prevented us from like gestating what's going on or something like that. It's
having time to mull over and think and critically think is a position of people with privilege now, who have the time and financial ability to be able to do that. It's also a privilege of education as well. I should say on what we've ended up talking about, which you may as well throw your questions out the window.
Oh yeah,
because it hasn't gone how we're going to go at all. The demise of trade unions has been a major aspect as well in that. I think that's important to state, because if you look back, especially to the poorest communities, they were centred around their trade unions, centred around the organising that came with that, and the political education that came with that, and the understanding of how the system operated that came with that. Now working classes are abandoned, effectively, with no sense of community outside their own areas and own postcodes, and even that is somewhat decimated by the way we live in the system now. So the trade unions are another element of this kind of regression that I spoke about earlier.
I hadn't thought of it as trade unions as contributing to that understanding of the system. That's a really good point.
But families used to revolve around them. I mean, I know lived experience. I remember every Friday night I was dragged off to the trade union social club because my parents would be doing amateur dramatics with all the other people in the union, and on Tuesday night I'd stay at my nan's because they'd be going up the social club to the bar, and there used to be, the whole focus used to, the family quite often revolved around the trade union. It would be the pub they went to in the evening. The mother or father would go off to the trade union meetings. It's where they get their political understanding of how the system operated, what was going on. It's where they get a lot of the news from back in the day before, we live in this age of constant information now. I think that's played a big factor in the breakdown of the way we organise ourselves as a species, even further to what it was already. I mean, it wasn't ideal anyway in the first place. It was by no means brilliant, but it kind of half trundled along in a way that at least people had access and time to be able to critically think and think about how they would like to see things change and how things could be changed. Even that ability is gone now because of the system. It's always the system. The system's always the problem. But so the other thing I do is a lot of music work. It's mostly reggae, dancehall and Afrobeats. And I speak to a lot of Rastafari people. And it's a fascinating religion. I'm not religious. I'd say I'm agnostic probably. But it's a fascinating religion, and everything comes back to the system, which they call Babylon. But the analogy works in terms of, if you view it non-religiously, that actually it's the system that does everything. It's not some new world order with a group of shady men sitting at a table. That's nonsense. It's the system is just what it is, and people get caught up in it, and it just trundles along of its own accord, effectively.
We've come quite nicely actually to something I wanted to make a point about here is that I think that you're semi-right in saying that the time poverty is not something that happens to the wealthier or the more privileged, and I think that's definitely an aspect of it. But the other thing that I think we need to remember is that this fucking thing, this God, or not God, this gift from the gods of Silicon Valley. That's what it is. It's like a little piece of tech that they hand down to us. It's like, here, go nuts.
That's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, but that's the thing that I see as being the thing that consumes a lot of our time. I read this fantastic book by Cal Newport called Deep Work, and it's basically about how tech and social media and phones have destroyed our ability to have silence in our brain or just in our life generally, and that loss of silence and time to think has meant that we don't process things as much. We don't mull things over in the same way. It's all very sort of our brains are never quiet and still to think, basically. And I feel like that's one of the things that's holding humanity back, is that, because it's very, very fun and distracting, but I have to put timers on and app blocks, and I have to really consciously try to not spend loads of time on it. And I think that if we were to be as hopeful as possible, the best thing for people would be to everyone just go get a Nokia 3310. But I mean, I like a lot of the aspects of the tech, so you can film and stream from protests, or you can show, we wouldn't have any idea about half the protests happening in the world if we didn't have people live streaming from them and photos. It's the revolution will not be televised trope is very accurate.
Yeah.
I think it's more and more so as the press become just unabashedly fucking biased.
Yes.
But do you think that you talked about there's like almost a planned or intentional regression? I think like was a sort of the something you were suggesting at least earlier. Like, to what extent do you think that is like happening? Are we like being regressed as a species by the shady men in the room?
And that's the key point, I think. This is not. It's always Chomsky has something for every single fucking situation. And the very famous interview he did with Ma, where he was trying to explain to Ma that he was an establishment journalist and blah, blah, blah. Effectively, you are working, and the whole notion of why you got into journalism, what journalism should be about, is lost. And Ma saying, yes, but I don't believe that. And Chomsky saying, no, of course, but if you believe something else, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. And that takedown of Ma from Chomsky applies to everything. The reason it applies to everything is because this is not a case of a few people and a few individuals pulling the strings of everyone else. This is not what this is about. This is just how the system has evolved as a whole, and how technology has evolved as a whole. And then at the end of the day, the majority of people have to live within this system, whether it be you are I don't know, the CEO of BlackRock, or you are a
shout out to our future overlords,
or whether you are selling weed on a council estate. You all have to survive in the system. It's not that there is some huge group of men, like the overrated Bilderberg conference or whatever. That's not the case. It is the system. It's just the way things are moving forward. It is almost kind of Terminator James Cameron-esque in terms of that it is just taking over. It's not. I mean, there are some elements that are, of course, designed to ensnare us, like the bane of everyone's life, cookies, and the way that we are tracked and what we like is monitored, and therefore things are tailored and customized to entice us in, blah, blah, blah. But that's consumerism. That's always been the same way from when the dawn of advertising. Well, not even from the dawn of advertising, from throughout human history. Yeah. We've always been encouraged to want more. It's sort of, again, we're back to hierarchy again. It's always been a case of, so, for example, back in I think it was medieval times, people used to eat bread. Rich people used to eat white bread, and poor people used to eat brown bread, because brown bread was considered, it was the husks and it wasn't really worth anything. Of course, what was actually going on was that poor people lived longer because their diet was brown bread. But the rich people who were eating the white breads, the poor people all wanted that. And so we all ended up eating white bread. It's always been the same. It's carrot and stick, and it's always been the same, and it's the same now. It's not, I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just the way the system is. It's just the way we have organised ourselves, and it's almost in our DNA to want more and to need more and buy more. It's just on steroids now because of the rise of technology and how technologically advanced we have become. It's all powerful, and it just operates of itself. I think you're correct. I think mobile phones and access to information is now becoming a detriment. It's too much. And you cannot sort the wheat from the chaff. Unless you really try really fucking hard to.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even bother looking at my Twitter timeline because it's a nightmare. I'd have to cut it back to about 10 people.
It's like, I describe it sometimes as like staring into the time vortex.
Yes.
It's like, the master in Doctor Who stares into the time vortex and he goes mad. It's like, that's what I sometimes think of when I'm like looking at my Twitter feed. I'm just like, no, Josh, this is just going to drive you insane. Like,
Exactly, but it's exactly so, and it's not a few people doing this. It's just the way we've evolved and the way our system has ended up, and it's the same principles as it's always has been. The majority of us have to be kept wanting more and desiring more and wanting more things to keep us working and plodding along and keep us content. It's just now it's like a hyperdrive madness going on in terms of our access to technology. And so in that respect, the powers that be, who are well aware of the fact this is going on, it suits them. It's even better. This is the best they've ever had it. because we are so distracted and so all consumed now by the system that it suits them. It's like universal credit. To change tactic entirely in what we're talking about, but not actually change at all what we're talking about. Universal credit is another perfect example. I wrote about this at the time back in 2018. Universal credit was designed, as most people know, by Ian Duncan Smith's think tank back in the seeds of it was sown in about 2007, before the Tories even got into power. And the idea behind it was that there were 5 pathways to poverty that poor people chose to walk along, and it was their fault that they were poor. And you have to break these pathways. It was addiction, it was welfare dependency, it was mental health, it was something else anyway. 5 pathways that we chose to walk along, and it was our fault we were poor. And if you broke these pathways and directed them in a new direction, then they wouldn't be poor anymore, and everyone could. And their exact words were, everyone would have the opportunity to climb the ladder. Universal credit was literally designed carrot and stick kind of syndrome, in that, well, if you work a bit more, then you'll get off welfare, and you can have what everyone else has and be like everyone else. It was designed with that in mind, that to play into people's most base emotions, firstly of envy and jealousy, of saying, well, if you work a bit more, you'll get to keep more of your money, so you can buy some more things and eventually get off welfare, which is how universal credit works. The more you work, the more likely you are to get off it, and you also keep a bit more of your money as well. And therefore, by default, you won't have the stigma of being a scrounger anymore, etc., etc. It was designed as a carrot and stick situation, but it was also designed, as UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty Philip Alston describes, as a digital workhouse, because everyone else, be that disabled people, sick people, people living with mental health issues, or people who could not physically get enough work, would be left stuck on this scrap heap under universal credit.
Like it's like, in theory, I like the thing where you get like, as you go into work, you're still getting some help, and like that's fine if you're just like an ordinary person in between jobs, or like trying to start a career in something, or like doing some part-time work because you're you're a parent or a carer or something like that. But it's not a one size fits all thing. It's just like, it's a pain in the ass if you're like in need of any sort of benefits beyond just like some sort of equivalent of job seekers allowance, essentially.
And then that's another fundamental flaw with it. It was designed, as you quite rightly say, as a one-size-fits-all system. People's lives are not one-size-fits-all. People's lives are inherently complex, especially people who, for whatever reason, need social security support. You cannot simplify that into one system. It was always going to fail, and as we're seeing now, I mean, it's a clusterfuck of epic proportions. But it's supposed to be that way. It was carrot and stick, again. So therefore, it's just another same mechanism in the system as a whole. It's this idea of dangling something to keep us all content and keep us in our place and keep us buying things, because a lot of it revolves around consumerism. And as I said, universal credit is one example. Overall, it's just gone mad because of technology, and it suits the powers that be. It suits people who are in positions of privilege to keep us this way and encourage us to be more.
Yeah. So I want to finish then with the one thing I did definitely want to talk about. It's my favorite topic, and we've come nicely onto it. So one thing that technology has given us is the zero commission trading apps that let us buy GameStop stock. So we're currently about to see, or hopefully going to see, some more action with things going on in that realm. If things really blow up and, we turn the system on its head, we'll see if that happens. I mean, I'm change day to day on how likely I think that is. Yeah. But you described the GameStop movement back in like January, February. I think it was February you wrote your piece. That you said you didn't think it was a revolution. You felt that it was like, you can say if I've characterized this poorly, but like that it was a revolution of like, it wasn't some working class people all sitting around. It wasn't like the impoverished sitting around making money. It was like a bunch of middle to upper class people who had the resources to go and buy a whole bunch of stock. Basically, that it was like the ordinary person doesn't have $500 sitting around in their bank account that they can just use, which I definitely think is an accurate summation of it. But like for me, I was broke as shit when I bought my shares, and I was just like buying like a couple of quid, like, well, not a couple of quid, but like 20, 30, 40 pound at a time to like get to what I have now in terms of that. But it was like, so it basically became my savings account. I'm not alone there either. I've seen many posts like that. But do you still feel like that? Do you think it's not like a lot of people are looking at it like this moment where all of a sudden there might be some like serious change or revolution in some way? Do you still think it's not quite that? Do you think it's still sort of like a privileged movement?
Okay, so to make one point immediately from the off, what I did think was really very important about it, and as I said in the article I wrote, was that what the whole GameStop situation did was actually expose that the system is rigged. For the first time, it properly, completely unpicked the way that what I would call a corporatist system operates, in terms of that stock markets are not free at all, as most of us know. Well, those of us who look into this have known for a very long time. Stock markets are not free.
It's not a free market.
And actually what happened with GameStop was that the market was working how it's supposed to fucking work. In terms of that anyone could come along and invest and make a load of money. That's how laissez-faire economics should be operating, but it's never obviously operated like that. And the whole GameStop situation was a very, very important turning point in opening up the understanding of actually how corrupt the stock market system is, and bringing that to a wider audience. Because again, and it kind of, if you, as you were talking to me earlier about how would we change things, it was a very good example of what could actually possibly be done. Because video games, technology, whatever, everyone's involved in it. Most people had heard of GameStop in some way, shape or form. And it was a sort of a perfect touchstone to try and get people to understand what was happening within the stock markets and what the issues were with it. Do I still think it wasn't revolutionary?
It's not over yet.
It's not over yet. It depends on what the point of the revolution would have been. So I cannot detract from the fact that still I maintain that most people either couldn't afford to do it, or they would not even be in the right place to do it in the first place. I don't know anyone who uses Reddit on my council stove. Who uses Reddit? Seriously.
Mostly it's gamers and tech bros.
Right. So who have access to tech in the first place.
Yeah.
You have to bear in mind, for example, my partner didn't get internet until 2015. She couldn't afford it. You have to bear in mind nearly 2 million disabled people in the UK do not have internet.
Oh, 2 million?
Did you not know this?
No, I didn't know it was 2 million.
Of course not. But why would you know it? No offence. No, over 4 million people still do not have internet access in this country. 1.8 million of them are disabled people. So by default, you have to be in a position of some sort of privilege in the first place to firstly know about the stock market, secondly know about Reddit, know how to navigate Reddit, and know how to navigate yourself into the subreddit group that was involved in this in the first place. That comes with privilege. It depends on your definition and what sort of parameters you're putting on privilege, but it comes with privilege regardless. Do I think it was revolutionary? It depends on what you wanted the outcome of the revolution to be. I was very interested. You write very well and you make very compelling arguments. I'm not patronising, I'm just saying, because I've read your website over and over before I came here today to the moon, and sort of the background to you wanting to write this book and your crowdfunding. And I was very interested, and I want to ask you actually and throw it back to you so we could come to a sort of conclusion between us. You quoted Mark E. Thomas, didn't you, as saying about the golden age of capitalism, and that actually was the situation with GameStop a opportunity to return to that kind of model of capitalism before the 1980s, with sort of pre-Big Bang, if you like, and complete deregulation and the whole subprime fiasco that happened after that. Was GameStop an opportunity to return to the golden age of capitalism? So on that basis, we're talking post-war?
Yeah.
Post-war to 1980.
Yeah.
Okay. So how would that, for you, as someone actively involved in the GameStop cycle, what would that revolution look like? Because that's what I could not settle on.
Okay.
I understand the principle of what was being said about how this could be revolutionary, because of course it could. Take my views on privilege and the people who bought the shares in the first place out of the equation, because in some way we all have a lack of privilege compared to the 1%.
Yeah.
We do. Take that out of the equation. I struggle to see what that revolution would look like.
Okay. Right. So
you framed it in terms of golden age of capitalism. That piqued my interest. I was like, okay, so what would it look like? And then I can tell you whether I think it's a revolution or not.
Okay. So there's a couple of things that I think it could potentially bring change in. First off, I think that if this plays out in the way that a lot of people hope that it does, then it will result in the largest top-down wealth transfer ever in history. That's fucking stunningly brilliant to me. That is something it would be a revolution in that sense. For me, it's already been a revolution in people realizing how powerful they can be as a collective, as a group, when they're all committed to a cause, and they stay focused on it. One of the most interesting things for me about the whole thing has been like watching this community not descend into like the kind of madness that normally happens on the internet when you get a bunch of people alleging massive amounts of corruption and fraud. Normally it ends up with, it just goes down like you end up at QAnon, basically. You always end up something, Jews run the world, satanic elites, bankers, etc. It always ends up, Pizzagate, it always ends up there. And then it's like, well, no one listens to you anymore. But this has managed to stay really focused. So I'm hoping that it can change how we understand our ability to affect the system. So that's what I'm really hoping, that like if there can be a fundamental change in just like, say they change how the stock market works, they try and make it more transparent, or anything that comes from this will be proving to people that we're not on an inevitably like a vicious circle into descent into just some sort of dystopia. It's like, look, enough people were passionate, informed, intelligent, and they like focused on something and they changed something. And like, we don't see fucking change ever anymore. We see things get worse and worse and sort of slowly degrading. We don't see positive change. And I think if something good can come of this, some sort of reform, something like substantial, that it will be a revolution in terms of like, people will all see that like things can get better, and like it doesn't have to end like Obama. They can actually get better. That's how I would see it, at least.
Okay, so I concur on your point about how the movement didn't implode in on itself and turn into conspiracy. I think that's quite an interesting point, actually. And when I was looking at it, and again looking at the story and what's been going on over the past few days, knowing I was going to come and speak to you about it, it has stayed. It's very interesting. It's managed to stay more coherent than the left wing in this country could ever wish for.
Yeah.
I mean, you take one look at left wing Twitter, and they're all pulling strips out of each other all the time. So that's a very interesting point. And there could be an argument for almost a model there of how we can unite around one issue with a common shared goal, because everyone seems to be on the same page within the community on this issue. I mean,
like no one brings up politics. No one cares who you are, and like, maybe that's helped by the anonymity sort of sense of it. But it is about like their goal. It's so inspiring.
I find that very interesting, actually. Yeah, so I concur on that point. That's quite, I'll think about that some more. It's quite interesting. Your notion of largest wealth redistribution I find more interesting. How would that work when, as you well know, because you kind of snarled about them earlier, when BlackRock made $3 billion from the GameStop situation? I'm not asking you to answer that as a rhetorical question.
No.
Because this is you're interviewing me.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of that.
No, that's fine. I get what you meant, because you made that. You kind of made that point in your article as well, that it was wasn't just about like David versus Goliath. Like there was like David versus Goliath, basically, that we were sort of just like the retail investors as such were sort of along for the ride. I think that there's obviously going to be hedge funds that are going to make money out of this. But if you're to believe the theories, the retail investors own the float. Like they have substantially increased the amount of shares that they have since January. Like there's one thread that I brought up a couple of times when talking to people on Reddit that I saw, and it was like, hey, I've like quadrupled my shares since January, and this was a couple of months ago, and people keep buying, but like I've quadrupled my shares. And then the whole thread, like hundreds and thousands of comments being like, oh yeah, I've got 10 times more than I did in January, I've got 5 times more, I've got 20 times more. It's like I'm pretty convinced that there's a lot of synthetic or phantom shares out floating around in there. I think that the retail investors own the company at this point. I think they have bought enough shares to own the company.
Yep.
And therefore that's a shit ton of money and a shit ton of people who might be in some sort of position of privilege, but like a lot of them are just like sort of middle class people, or what would be considered the middle class, or like just somewhere in the middle there. They're not that them having a lot more money is what would be to me the largest top-down wealth transfer. Like it might, because you might see some wealth go from one hedge fund to another. It's like, fair enough, that's just the top, like the elite, like exchanging money between each other basically. Yep. But like combined with that, you would see theoretically a lot of people making a lot of money, and they say at least that they're going to do many good things with that. I don't know if that's going to happen, but yeah, okay, we'll see.
Again, I find it interesting, and I don't disagree with your theses on paper. I'm sure it could happen. I can't see, based on, as you say, what's going on and with the sort of legal wranglings that happen and what's coming out. I mean, it's a fascinating story. At least what's coming out of the collusion between Robin Hood and Citadel is fascinating. I mean,
Ken Griffin.
Yeah, there's a movie in there somewhere.
Oh yeah, the movie is all like I interviewed a guy who wrote a book, who'd written The Social Network, or the book that became The Social Network. So he has just written a book, but he wrote about January. He's completely ignored the rest of the story.
But it's just getting interesting now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm in it, that I've been watching the whole time. Yeah. I've lucked into it. Do you know what I mean? I started not expecting it to end up here, but
it's getting interesting. And I don't disagree with your wealth transfer notion and how it is disrupting the system. But for me, what is the end result of that? So if we're talking about some sort of...
So you want to know what they do with the money, basically?
No, I'm not interested in what people do with their money. Okay. That's not my issue. My issue is what's left in the aftermath of it. So to pick up on the quote you gave, so it wasn't your quote, it was Mark E. Thomas's quote about the golden age of capitalism. That kind of post-war to 1980 period has been widely debunked by economic historians now, because actually it wasn't the golden age of capital. It wasn't barely capitalism in any way, shape or form. It was mixed economy. Mixed economy. Because in America, so you had... to instigate this kind of idea of the American dream and this notion of capitalism, the government firstly had to do the GI Bill of Rights, for example. They had to deregulate home ownership. You still had the civil rights movement coming through, which then changed a lot. And really, it was government intervention, perpetual war, in the same way if you trace back... say to the First World War, the same principles apply in the way J.P. Morgan underwrote this country's loans to fund World War One. It's not really capitalism in terms of what we consider laissez-faire free market capitalism. It's still manipulated and run by government. I don't think we've ever had proper capitalism. I would, in the same way, I don't think we've ever had proper communism. It's all. I don't think it's ever properly existed in the way that it's written about in the theory books. In my opinion. So it's not about whether or not I have no issue with transfer of wealth. I hope people do make a lot of money from it, good for them. The issue is what's left in its aftermath, and is a system where certain people still have more access to the ability to earn 10 times more money than everyone else, because you cannot say on a planet of 7 billion people we can all be stocks and shares investors.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Can we?
I mean, obviously that's like a
How would that
theoretical
work?
sense.
How would we eradicate the gaping inequality under a truly laissez-faire system?
I mean,
you'd still have bosses and workers, and you'd still have human emotions of greed and desire. And if you want to go even deeper than that, you may like to read a book by an author called, as I mentioned him earlier, Will Black, called Psychopathic Cultures. He's trained in psychology, but he's now an anthropologist.
Okay. Sounds really interesting.
Power corrupts, ultimately, because he believes, and he's kind of evidenced it out with quantitative evidence, that actually the problem we have as a species is quite often that psychopaths or sociopaths run institutions of power, and their behaviour spreads out and affects everyone around them. My issue was with any type of revolution, and with what we're discussing here in terms of GameStop and what the aftermath and what actually proper free market capitalism would look like, is human emotions get in the way. Human greed and wanting and desire, which, as I was saying at the start of this show, come from actually tens of thousands of years of conditioning in societies where we've been encouraged to want more. We're not born greedy apart from the need for food and water. Greed in terms of material greed has been encouraged, and it's almost in our DNA now to want more. It's been encouraged since the earliest civilizations. Whenever you put those into the mix, power gets corrupted. And I can't see, and it goes back to my half-empty analogy earlier about myself, I can't see any system that's going to be able to change that. And free market capitalism, where you have the opportunity to make as much money as you want, just leads to the same thing. Unless you can tell me how we can all be equal stock and share investors.
Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't say that we can all be equal ones.
Right.
What I meant
don't
was
have
that,
an issue
we
with
can have a system where, because they had in the 50s in America, it was like it's like buy part of America, I think, or something like own part of America, I think was like the slogan that was around. And most people took like their savings and they owned little bits of companies they liked. I think that's a pretty cool thing. Like, to be honest, I think it's it would be a great thing to have people taking. I mean, obviously we have to get to a point where people have the money like this to save. This is just very theoretical, but I don't think it's impossible to imagine that people would, in a actual like functioning system, like want to have a little bit of stake in companies that they liked. Basically, that's.
And what went wrong with that scheme in America?
I mean, it got corrupted, like
right. But this wouldn't.
Then it's a constant struggle, you know. I mean, we can't like, I don't think there's ever a perfect system. It's for me, it's a constant, like the system will constantly degrade and become corrupted. And I think that it's our responsibility as like stakeholders in society to not let that happen. That's how I look at it, at least anyway. It's this, like, you can't, like, okay, we can imagine a better system, but that system is never going to stay forever. It's going to, as soon as you make something, like, entropy sets in, you have to like constantly fight to like keep it as it is, or as it should be functioning, hopefully, for the benefit of the many, not the few. But yeah. So yeah, anyway, we've done an hour and 20 minutes here. So
blimey.
Yeah,
sorry about that.
Through. No, keep going. But I only have the room for like another 20 minutes, so I need to pack up.
I really enjoyed speaking to you.
Yeah,
it was very, very, very good.
Yeah, a lot of fun. So do you want to like give a shout out about anything, like plugs or whatever?
No, don't do that. Thank you.
Okay,
That's
well,
fine. Thank you anyway.
Links for any of the stuff we've talked about, Steve's Twitter, etc., will be in the description.
Oh yeah, it's at Mr. Topple. Sorry. Yeah, I should plug myself, shouldn't I? Really? Yeah, it's at Mr. Topple on social media.
Right, that's there in the description for everyone. But yeah, thanks. Bye, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate you tuning in and making it all the way to the end of the show. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.